Most people think the reason their garden looks ordinary is because they need expensive furniture, fancy decorations, or a professional landscaper. I used to believe that too, and every spring I found myself looking at magazines and garden centers thinking I had to spend hundreds of dollars just to make my little backyard feel special. The truth is, I was making the same mistake that so many people still make today. I was walking right past the one material that could completely change the way my garden looked without emptying my wallet. It was old wood, simple boards, weathered branches, forgotten pallets, tree stumps, and pieces that most people would burn or throw away. Once I learned how to see them differently, everything around me changed. My garden did not suddenly become bigger, but it started looking warmer, richer, and more welcoming. Friends began asking who designed it, and they were always surprised when I told them almost every wooden feature had been made with my own hands over slow weekends using leftover materials. That is exactly why I wanted to sit down with you today, because I know many people over 50 want a beautiful place to relax, but they also want to be smart with their money. You do not need complicated projects or expensive tools. You only need a few simple ideas and a different way of looking at ordinary wood. Over the next few minutes, I am going to show you 30 rustic wooden decorations that quietly transform a garden until it feels like something from a country home that has been loved for generations. Most of these ideas cost very little. Some are almost free, and every single one can be adapted to fit a small backyard or a larger garden. A few of them were shown to me many years ago by an older neighbor who never wasted anything useful, and even today I still smile every time I use those same little tricks. The first idea may seem almost too simple to matter, but it creates an effect that many expensive gardens completely miss, and once you notice it, you will probably never look at an old piece of wood the same way again. Dot. The first thing I started doing was looking at every old wooden board as if it already had a purpose instead of seeing it as waste. That simple change in thinking saved me more money than any gardening trick I ever learned. One of the easiest ways to make a garden feel more expensive is by creating different levels instead of leaving everything flat and empty. Years ago, an older friend showed me how he stacked thick reclaimed boards into low planting boxes without worrying about making them look perfect. The wood had cracks, knots, and faded colors from years of weather, but that was exactly what gave the garden its character. Today, people pay a fortune for furniture that looks aged, while nature has already done the work for free. I built my first raised flower bed using leftover fence boards that were headed for the firewood pile. After brushing off the dirt and cutting them to size, I simply screwed them together, filled the inside with branches, compost, and soil, and planted herbs along the edges. Almost overnight, that corner stopped looking forgotten and started looking intentional. Visitors often assumed the boxes had been bought from an expensive garden center, but they were made almost entirely from wood that nobody else wanted. Then I discovered something even simpler. Instead of throwing away thick tree branches after trimming, I laid them along flower beds as natural borders. The uneven shapes looked softer than plastic edging and blended into the landscape much better. After a few weeks, they looked as though they had always belonged there. Very few people do this anymore because most homeowners immediately buy manufactured borders without realizing that natural wood creates a warmer feeling. Another little trick that made a surprising difference was placing an old weathered stump beside a pathway instead of removing it. I added a clay pot filled with colorful flowers on top, and suddenly that old stump became one of the first things people noticed when entering the garden. Sometimes the simplest decoration catches the eye because it feels honest rather than perfect. I also learned not to worry if every piece of wood matched in color. In fact, mixing lighter and darker boards often creates more depth and makes everything appear collected over many years instead of purchased all at once. That relaxed feeling is what gives rustic gardens their quiet charm. There is another decoration I almost ignored because it seemed far too ordinary, but once I tried it, the entire atmosphere around my seating area changed, and even now I would never build another garden without it. For years, I thought a comfortable garden needed expensive furniture before anyone could truly enjoy it. but I eventually learned that the surroundings matter just as much as the chair you sit on. One afternoon, I used a few rough cedar boards that had been leaning against my shed for years and built a simple wooden bench beside my vegetable garden. It was nothing fancy. The cuts were not perfect. The wood carried old nail holes, and the color was uneven from years of sun and rain. Still, after placing it beneath a small fruit tree, the entire corner suddenly felt peaceful. People naturally wanted to stop there, sit for a while, and enjoy the view. That little bench became one of the most valuable additions I ever made, not because it cost money, but because it created a destination inside the garden. Then I started thinking about the empty walls of my fence. Most people leave them completely bare, but those vertical spaces are full of opportunities. I fastened several weathered wooden crates to the fence at different heights and filled them with herbs, trailing flowers, and small pots. The result surprised me. Instead of staring at a plain wooden fence, the eye was drawn toward layers of plants that added color and depth without taking up valuable ground space. An older gardener once told me that when your eyes move upward, a garden automatically feels larger than it really is. I never forgot that advice because he was absolutely right. Another idea that quietly transformed my yard was using old wooden ladders. Many people throw them away once they become unsafe for climbing, but they make wonderful displays for flower pots, lanterns, or even small baskets filled with seasonal decorations. I leaned one against my shed, placed 3 clay pots on the steps, and suddenly that plain wall became one of the most photographed corners whenever family visited. Little by little, I realized that rustic gardens are built through dozens of small details rather than one giant project. I also found that simple wooden signs add personality without looking forced. I carved the names of herbs into small pieces of reclaimed wood and placed them beside my planting beds. They were far from perfect, but that handmade look made everything feel more welcoming. The funny thing is that imperfections often make a garden appear more authentic than expensive store-bought decorations ever could. Most people chase perfection when what they truly admire is character. There is one forgotten wooden feature that almost disappeared from modern gardens, yet every time I build one it becomes the conversation piece everyone remembers first, and that simple idea is where I discovered just how powerful ordinary wood can really become. One feature that always surprises people is a simple wooden arch, and the funny thing is that it does not have to be large or expensive to make a powerful impression. The first one I ever built came from 2 old fence posts and a handful of leftover boards that had been sitting behind my garage for years. I was not trying to build anything perfect. I simply wanted to create a small entrance between my vegetable beds and the flower garden. Once I added a climbing rose on one side and a clematis on the other, everything changed. As the seasons passed, the plants slowly wrapped themselves around the wood until the structure looked as though it had been standing there for decades. Every visitor naturally walked toward it because an arch quietly invites people to keep exploring. That is something many expensive gardens understand very well. They create curiosity instead of showing everything at once. You can do exactly the same thing with a few pieces of reclaimed wood and a little patience. Another forgotten idea that deserves much more attention is using old wooden barrels or half barrels as garden accents. Even if they have cracks and can no longer hold water, they make wonderful homes for flowers, herbs, or even small shrubs. I once rescued an old barrel that someone had left by the roadside. After cleaning it and filling it with soil, I planted lavender and trailing ivy together. Within one summer, it became one of the most attractive corners in the yard. People often asked where I bought it because weathered wood has a richness that fresh lumber simply cannot copy. I also discovered that small wooden bridges do not need a pond beneath them to look beautiful. A short, decorative bridge crossing a dry creek bed filled with stones or even connecting 2 garden paths adds movement and gives the impression that the garden is larger than it really is. Most people never think about this because they assume a bridge belongs only over water, but an older gardener showed me otherwise many years ago, and I have never forgotten the effect it creates. One more simple project that anyone can build is a rustic wooden trellis. Instead of buying metal panels from a garden center, I gathered several straight branches after a storm and tied them together with sturdy outdoor twine. The finished trellis looked natural rather than manufactured, and my climbing beans covered it so completely that by midsummer the wood seemed to disappear beneath the leaves. Sometimes the decoration itself is only the beginning. Nature finishes the rest in a way no factory ever could. As I kept adding these quiet wooden touches, I noticed something unexpected. My garden no longer felt like a collection of separate plants. It started feeling like one complete place where every path invited you toward another small discovery. And the next few ideas may be the easiest of all, yet they create some of the strongest first impressions the moment someone steps through your gate. As beautiful as rustic wood can be, I have also learned that there are a few mistakes that can keep these ideas from looking charming. Instead of creating a warm and welcoming garden, they can make everything feel cluttered or neglected. I made nearly every one of those mistakes myself before I figured out what really works. The biggest one is trying to decorate every empty space. When people discover reclaimed wood projects, they often become excited and start placing wooden wheels, barrels, crates, signs, birdhouses, benches, and planters everywhere. Before long, the eye has nowhere to rest. The garden no longer feels peaceful because every corner is asking for attention at the same time. An older gentleman once told me something I have never forgotten. He said that every decoration should have enough space around it to tell its own story. At first, I did not understand what he meant, but after removing a few extra pieces from my own yard, everything suddenly looked better. Sometimes taking one decoration away improves the entire garden more than adding another one. Another mistake that many people make is using brand new wood without giving it any character. Fresh lumber has its place, but when every board is bright and perfectly smooth, the garden can feel unfinished. If I have to use new wood, I simply leave it outside for a while, brush it lightly with a wire brush, or allow nature to soften its appearance over time. There is no need to force an artificial antique look. Sun, rain, and changing seasons are patient craftsmen, and they usually do a better job than we ever could. I also learned not to ignore the small details. Old rusty hinges, simple iron handles, wooden pegs, or even a few visible handmade joints can make a simple project feel much more authentic. These little touches are easy to overlook, but they quietly add personality. One thing that surprises many people is how important plants are to the success of wooden decorations. Wood alone can feel heavy if there is no greenery around it. I like to let flowers spill over the edges of wooden boxes or allow climbing vines to soften fences, trellises, and arches. After a season or two, the wood and the plants seem to belong together. That natural partnership is what creates the feeling people admire. It never looks like the decoration was placed there yesterday. Instead, it feels as though it has always been part of the landscape. Another simple habit I have adopted is leaving a few weathered imperfections alone. A small crack, a faded corner, or a knot in the grain often adds more charm than a perfectly polished surface. Gardens are living places, and they should never feel too perfect. They should invite people to slow down, take a closer look, and notice the little things. That is exactly what rustic wood does when it is used with restraint. There is still one final lesson I want to share because, in my experience, it is the reason some gardens stay beautiful year after year, while others slowly lose the warmth that made them special in the first place. By this point, I had stopped thinking about my garden as a collection of projects and started thinking about how it made people feel the moment they stepped through the gate. That turned out to be the biggest difference of all. Anyone can buy expensive decorations, but creating a place where people naturally want to slow down takes a little more thought than money. One of the easiest ways I found to do that was by building small wooden displays that changed with the seasons. In the spring, I might place an old wooden crate near the entrance filled with colorful flowers and a small watering can. During the summer, that same crate could hold clay pots overflowing with herbs. In autumn, I filled it with pumpkins, dried grasses, and pine cones, and around the holidays I added evergreen branches and simple lanterns. The crate itself never changed, yet it always looked fresh because what surrounded it reflected the season. That little habit made my garden feel alive all year without spending very much. Another idea that quietly transformed the space was using simple wooden shelves outdoors. I built mine from leftover boards attached to sturdy posts beside the shed. Instead of hiding empty pots and garden tools, I arranged them neatly alongside small plants, old watering cans, baskets, and a few family treasures that could handle being outside. It was not about filling every shelf. In fact, I learned that leaving empty space often makes each object stand out even more. Most people make the mistake of adding too much because they believe more decorations create more beauty. In reality, a few carefully chosen pieces create a calmer and richer feeling. I also discovered that lighting completely changes how wooden decorations are seen. During the day, reclaimed wood has warmth and texture, but in the evening, soft light brings it to life in an entirely different way. I wrapped warm white solar lights around a simple wooden arch and placed a few lanterns on tree stumps along the garden path. Nothing was bright or flashy. The gentle glow simply highlighted the natural grain of the wood and made the entire garden feel inviting after sunset. Friends often stayed outside much longer because the space felt comfortable instead of overly illuminated. One lesson an older neighbor shared with me many years ago has stayed with me ever since. He said a beautiful garden should reveal itself little by little instead of showing everything at once. That advice changed how I placed every decoration. Rather than putting my best pieces where they could all be seen immediately, I scattered them throughout the garden so each short walk revealed something new. A rustic bench around one corner, a wooden birdhouse tucked into a tree, a handmade planter beside the vegetable beds, or a small sign hidden among the flowers. These little discoveries encouraged people to keep walking and looking more closely. Even I found myself noticing different details each morning with a cup of coffee in my hand. Before long, I realized that none of these ideas were really about wood at all. They were about creating memories, slowing down, and giving ordinary materials a second life. There is just one final thought I always share with anyone who asks how to make a garden feel truly special. And it is probably the simplest lesson I have learned in all my years of gardening. When I look around my garden today, I honestly do not see wooden decorations anymore. I see memories hidden inside ordinary pieces of timber that most people would have thrown away without a second thought. Every old board reminds me of a weekend project. Every weathered planter reminds me that beauty does not have to be expensive. Every bench reminds me to slow down for a few minutes instead of always rushing toward the next job. That may be the biggest lesson I have learned over the years. A garden is never really finished, and that is exactly what makes it so enjoyable. There is always another corner waiting for a simple improvement, another forgotten piece of wood that deserves a second life, or another quiet place where you can sit with a cup of coffee and appreciate everything you have created with your own hands. Many people believe a luxurious garden comes from a large budget, but I have found that it usually comes from patience, creativity, and paying attention to the little details that others overlook. Some of the most admired features in my own garden cost almost nothing. A weathered crate filled with flowers, a handmade trellis supporting climbing beans, an old ladder covered with colorful pots, a tree stump turned into a natural display, a simple wooden arch inviting people farther into the garden. None of these ideas required expensive materials or professional skills. They simply required looking at ordinary wood with fresh eyes. That is something every gardener can do, whether you have a large country property or a small backyard behind your home. Start with one project instead of trying to build everything at once. Enjoy the process. Let each season inspire the next improvement. Before long, you will notice something interesting. Your neighbors will begin asking questions. Friends will want to spend more time in your garden. Family gatherings will naturally move outdoors because the space feels warm and welcoming. Even you will find yourself walking outside more often just to enjoy a few quiet moments surrounded by the things you built yourself. That feeling cannot be purchased in any garden center. It grows little by little with every simple project you complete. If there is one thing I hope you remember after spending this time with me, it is that the most valuable material in your garden may already be sitting in a forgotten corner of your shed or stacked behind the garage waiting for a second chance. The next time you see an old board, a worn fence post, a weathered crate, or a sturdy tree stump, do not ask yourself whether it should be thrown away. Ask yourself what it could become. You may be surprised by how one small idea changes not only the look of your garden, but also the way you enjoy it every single day. And if you think reclaimed wood can transform a garden this much, wait until you discover the forgotten stone and metal projects that old gardeners have quietly used for generations, because some of those simple ideas create an even bigger impression while costing almost nothing at all.